Stand to, soldier! You thought that the trenches, mud, barbed wire, and chemical weapons of the First World War were bad? Well, fall in and squaddle up, because you're in for a whole other world of hurt. That's right, we're back for a sequel, World War II. And this time, it's still war, but it'll be a whole lot deadlier. First things first, this isn't your granddaddy's World War. Times have changed, and both tactics and weaponry have evolved quite a bit since the days of the Great War. From the devious new tactics and dangerous amounts of firepower that enemy forces are bringing to bear, to the innumerable threats from air, land, and sea. Here's why you wouldn't last 24 hours on the front lines of the Second World War. Now move out! While World War I was largely fought in the trenches, the second major globe-spanning conflict saw enlisted soldiers facing warfare on entirely different terrains and engaging their enemies on the land, in the air, and at sea, as well as the most horrifying style of warfare of them all, math, throughout the use of cryptography and secret ciphers. But let's start with some boots on the ground. With the land battle, also it's probably important to point out, we're talking about the threats the Allied forces faced. If you're under any delusions that you would have been fighting for the other side, well then this isn't the video or the website for you. With that out of the way, let's drop you right in the thick of it. An Allied soldier in the midst of the most deadly conflict in history. No, really. With 17% of men in Allied uniforms ultimately meeting an untimely end, you'd be lucky to make it to the end of lunchtime. Never mind seeing out the war until 1945. Overall, an estimated 70 to 85 million people were killed over the course of the Second World War. That was around 3% of the entire global population, estimated to be at 2.3 billion people in 1940. Even speaking purely statistically, you'd be considered lucky to see out the week. But that's enough math. Let's take a look at some of what you'd be up against fighting against the forces of Nazi Germany. Over the course of World War II, the Nazis employed a military tactic known as blitzkrieg. While you might more commonly associate that word with planes dropping bombs during air raids, that was only one part of a larger strategy. Roughly translated to lightning war, blitzkrieg was all about using the elements of speed and surprise to strike at your enemies. And that includes you, Private. You're up against an opposing force whose sole objective is to break through your army's lines as quickly as possible, using coordinated maneuvers and concentrated attacks involving armored vehicles and airstrikes, followed up by the Nazis' ground troops. Let's break down the blitzkrieg strategy first so you know roughly what you'd have to expect as a soldier on the receiving end of it. Then we'll follow up by going through some of the Nazis' more infamous weapons. After all, you're not going to make it through the war in one piece. You might as well know something about what your cause of death will likely be. As we mentioned, the first step of the blitzkrieg involved a lot of armored and motorized vehicles, which would be used to initiate swift, powerful attacks that, while only brief, would focus on breaking through your lines of defense. Assuming you weren't instantly killed by being caught in a barrage of tank shells and separated from your extremities, then you'd next be under the raining hellfire of an air raid. The second part of the blitzkrieg used swift aerial attacks to catch opposing troops off guard, likely while they were still reeling from the aforementioned armored vehicle attack. Before you've even had a chance to pick up you or your comrade's severed limbs, your ears still ringing from the bombing of tank shells, you look up to see a swastika-emblazoned bomb plummeting out of the sky directly toward you, as the Nazis take advantage of the element of surprise. Thirdly, blitzkrieg would see ground forces deployed, meaning if you by some miracle lived through the tank attack and the subsequent air raid, then several angry Nazis would soon be sweeping in the area to shoot any survivors on sight. You see, attacking in multiple different ways was intended to confuse the enemy's troops, making it harder to respond with a counterattack when the methods the Nazis were using were constantly changing. So unless you've been supplied with good intel on how the enemy is about to attack, you'd likely need a serious hand. Well, an entire arm, actually. Keep looking, we're sure it fell off somewhere around here. Of course, blitzkrieg wasn't all enacted as part of one singular attack, but on a much wider coordinated scale. Sending in tanks and planes and infantry, all one after another, would be a hell of a frivolous use of military resources. The point was, the blitzkrieg would constantly change up the battlefront the war was fought on, targeting weaker points in the Allies' defenses with one main point of attack. And then as their opposing forces mobilized to protect that weak point, the Nazis would break through and begin targeting another. All with the ultimate goal of Vernichtungsschlacht, or total annihilation, wiping out literally all of the Allied forces in order to secure a unilateral Nazi victory. Nazi forces first employed the tactics of blitzkrieg during their invasion of Poland in 1939. Within a year, their army had used the same tactics to mount multiple further invasions across Europe, including against France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And through these very same tactics, Nazi Germany was able to defeat France, Denmark, Norway, and Luxembourg, as well as kill 380,000 soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force that were stationed in France, all by 1941. At the same time, from the perspective of soldiers on the ground, they were up against an opposing army that seemed impossible to defeat, ferocious in their tactics, and unwavering and unquestioning in their loyalty to Hitler and his fascist ideology. Now, as we pointed out earlier, and as you've likely noticed, this is drastically different from how the preceding First World War was fought. And on the part of your opposition, the Nazis, that difference was very much intentional. You see, the doctrine of blitzkrieg and Vernichtungsschlag, the swift and brutal attacks and utter devastation of the enemy, were strategic ideals that emerged between the wake of World War I in 1918 and the start of World War II in 1939. The First World War was a war of attrition, fought in an ongoing near stalemate, as one side's forces in the trenches fought the other side's forces, also holed up in their own trenches, effectively in a race to the bottom being whoever ran out of resources first. That's not just food and ammo either. When we say resources, we mean troops like you. And that's right, as far as the generals are concerned, you are a resource too, and an expendable one at that. With advancements in tactics, the Nazis also brought improved weaponry to bear in the Second World War too, and the numerous progressions in the field of weapons technology between 1918 and 1939 meant that you, down in the front lines fighting back the Nazis, would be looking down the barrels of some pretty mean guns. Throughout the Second World War, bolt-action and machine guns were among some of the most prominent weapons you'd be facing off against. But whereas, say for example, the rifles back in 1914 would fire 15 whole rounds per minute, some of these new improved weapons were capable of firing 400 rounds per minute at ranges of up to 6,000 feet. That's a lot more bullets whizzing through the air, enough to give you an unexpected new lead-based facial piercing or a handy new permanent sleep aid by having a shot fired right through your brain. So let's take a closer look at the Nazis' arsenal, the guns that would in all likelihood prevent you from lasting very long on the front lines. The Karabiner 98K, sometimes shortened to the Kar 98K, was the standard issue weapon for most Nazi infantry. Designed by Mauser, a German arms manufacturer that had been producing weapons for the armed forces of Germany as early as the 1970s, the Karabiner 98K was the latest in the long line of bolt-action rifles and semi-automatic pistols that Mauser was famed for creating. An earlier variant of the Karabiner actually saw plenty of use during the First World War, with the updated modified 98K version being commonplace throughout World War II as well. The K, if you're wondering, wasn't shorthand for 1,000. It actually stood for Kurz, the German word for short. So, the Karabiner 98K was the standard issue rifle you'd likely be on the business end of when facing off against Nazi infantry. Now, the overconfidence in you might have you thinking that because rifles like this need their operator to lift and pull back a bolt to load in their next round, that might give you ample time to move out of the path of the next shot. Maybe in the second it takes for a Nazi soldier to chamber his next round, you could dolphin dive out of the way or dash to a better position to take retaliatory shots at him instead. But this isn't Call of Duty, kids. While bolt-action rifles like the Karabiner 98K were only capable of firing single cartridges at a time, that's not to say the Nazis weren't also packing fully automatic firing weapons too. You see, by around 1940, the Wehrmacht, that's the armed forces of Nazi Germany, realized they would need something with a higher rate of fire to improve their infantry's effectiveness in combat. Once they had submitted the specifications for this new breed of rifle, there were two competing designs for an automatic rifle, called the Gewehr 41 or G41, made by different manufacturers. The first, the Gewehr 41W, was made by Walther, the same manufacturer of James Bond's iconic PPK pistol. And the second of those automatic rifles, the Gewehr 41M, was designed and created by our old friends Mauser. Each had the goal of their weapons being distributed among the Wehrmacht troops during the remainder of the war, with both rifles submitted for trials in 1941. Do you even need to guess whose design the Nazis favored? Winning out over Walther was the Mauser version of the Gewehr 41. It was heavy, clunky, and unreliable, even though it was made to resemble the Karabiner 98K in an effort to make operating the rifle familiar to the Wehrmacht troops. The results seen after the initial use of the G41M among the troops on the Eastern Front were considered, well, less than satisfactory. Of the over 6,600 rifles manufactured before production was halted, more than 1,600 were returned and deemed unusable. But don't think that means you'd be safe from automatic gunfire. Given that the theater of warfare had changed since the trenches of World War I, infantry in the Second World War didn't need long-range bolt-action rifles except for certain specialists like snipers. Instead, because this war was being fought on a far different playing field, the ways in which soldiers used their weapons and what they required of these weapons also changed. Instead of shooting at an enemy dugout 2,000 yards away, closer range combat meant that newer guns only needed an effective range of around 400 yards, with a less powerful cartridge. Stop us when you see where we're going with this. While the kind of fully automatic rifles you worryingly might see at your local Walmart was still a little way off from development, there was another breed of rapid-firing weapon that you would not want to be on the receiving end of. Meet the humble submachine gun, or SMG, if you're one of the people who get tetchy about things like that. By far the most common, and we're sure some would even argue iconic, of the Nazis' World War II submachine guns was the MP40, widely distributed among the Axis powers and equipped with a 32-round magazine. Between 1940 and the end of the war in 1945, an estimated 1.1 million of these weapons were produced, and they even became a favorite of soldiers in various parts of the world long after the Second World War was over. The MP40, or Maschinenpistole 40, has even seen limited use in conflicts as recent as the Iraq War and the Syrian Civil War. This is all thanks to upwards of 200,000 of these guns being recovered and redistributed by the Allies after World War II, given to paramilitary and irregular forces of developing countries. They were used heavily by Nazi infantry troops, as well as by the paratroopers and armored vehicle crews all across the Eastern and Western fronts. And as for you and your fellow Allied soldiers, well, you can't even correctly identify this weapon, as the MP40 was erroneously referred to as the Schmeisser by the Allies after weapons designer Hugo Schmeisser. While he was responsible for designing the MP18, the first ever mass-produced submachine gun, Hugo Schmeisser had nothing to do with designing the MP40, which was designed by Heinrich Vollmer and inspired by its predecessor, the MP38. MP38s were highly similar to the subsequent MP40s in appearance and functionality, so both saw widespread distribution and usage among various parts of the Wehrmacht. They wouldn't be the only guns spraying lead at you in rapid succession on the front lines either. Erfurter Maschinenfabrik, or ERMA, who produced the MP40, also created a German copy of the British Sten gun, known as the MP3008, and other improved variants of existing SMGs would hit the battlefield before the war was over. Another similar submachine gun design emerged after being developed in 1943, hence its name, the MP43. While it might have fired less powerful cartridges, the weapon had a lighter recoil and it would have been easier to handle. However, fighting on the front lines, you could have almost escaped certain death at the hands of a Nazi wielding an MP43, if the Führer himself had been successful in trying to get the weapon's development halted. That's right, Adolf Hitler didn't want this gun to hit the battlefield. But don't worry, he wasn't fussed about it being unfair to Allied troops like you. No, instead he was pushing for an entirely different weapon. You see, Hitler had previously fought in the First World War, assigned to work as a courier delivering messages from leaders to the troops on the Western Front. It was probably this familiarity with how that war was fought that made him feel like his soldiers still needed weapons that could fire at longer ranges, like the 2,000-yard capable bolt-action rifles that were more widely in service back during the Great War. So when plans for the MP43 initially crossed his desk, the Führer gave his order to cease the wider production of the weapon, and instead, the focus should be on the development of something more long-range. And this is where it gets interesting, and why you would still have to worry about being on the wrong end of an MP43. The arms minister of Germany at the time actually went behind Hitler's back and approved the production of the MP43. The name was changed to include Maschinenpistole, the German word for machine pistol, since this was the widely used term for submachine guns. Hitler hated it. But with this one simple trick, the arms minister managed to get 3 separate factories producing MP43s, and Wehrmacht troops all across the Eastern Front were now clamoring to get their hands on these hot new guns. Hitler would have stayed none the wiser had the MP43 cover not been blown by some divisional commanders, who asked the Führer when they could expect shipments of these new weapons. Naturally, as he often was, Hitler was furious and ordered a full-blown investigation into what had happened. Luckily for the arms minister and the weapons factory workers who had disobeyed Hitler, his investigation revealed that the new and improved MP43 was so effective that the Führer changed his mind about them. Going forward, the weapon would be designated under a different name, the Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle. Yep, we lied before. The Nazis are part of the reason why we have assault rifles in the modern day. And this really doesn't bode well for your chances at survival, does it? The MP-43, now known as the Sturmgewehr 44, often shorted to STG-44, made history as the world's first successful assault rifle. It was more compact than the longer, larger bolt-action rifles that had seen battle throughout the First and Second World Wars, capable of a higher rate of controllable automatic fire, and would even go on to influence another famed weapon 2 years after World War II ended, the Soviet AK-47. So yes, the German granddaddy of a gun so famous it's still actively used across the world is one of the many Nazi weapons pointing at you. Basically, if you've somehow managed to last a few hours on the front, we wouldn't fancy your chances once the STG-44 starts spraying, since they were widely regarded as efficient, functional, and lethal. When it comes down to being turned into Swiss cheese by bolt-action rifle fire, submachine gun fire, or assault rifle fire, the choice is a hard one to really feel 100% confident about. But then there are the big guns. Oh yeah, we're not even close to being done describing just how many ways the Nazis had of shooting you to death. Luckily, when it comes to machine guns, they'd only settled on 2 options, the Maschinengewehr 34 and the Maschinengewehr 42. While both were produced until the end of the war, the MG42 was developed to replace the MG34, which was more expensive and took longer to make. The MG42 became the standard general-purpose machine gun for the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. This led to the MG42 being used to provide suppressing fire for Nazi troops against their enemies, and it even earned it the nickname of Hitler's buzzsaw, thanks in part to the sound it made, but also because it would cut down anything that stood in its path, you included. The MG42 was so reliable and easy to maintain that it eventually influenced the standard design for NATO light machine guns after World War II, particularly the United States Army's M60 machine gun, a favorite of the US Navy SEALs. The modern German Army continues to use a modernized version of the MG42 as their standard light machine gun, and if the longevity of this design tells you anything, it's that you really don't want to find yourself standing downrange at one of those things. Okay, you've disregarded all of our advice so far, you fool you. But maybe if you keep your head down, crawl around on your stomach in the mud, and try to avoid the bullets firing at you from all these dangerous newly developed guns, then maybe you might see the end of the week. Except while you're down there, you might want to watch your step, as one wrong move could see you very quickly obliterated in a variety of fun and gruesome ways. Let's talk about mines in a segment that we like to call How to Avoid Ending Up in Several Different Places All at Once. Among the assortment of anti-personnel mines that the Nazis used was one referred to as a pot mine. When stepped on, a vial containing acid would be crushed, and this would ignite a primer, which would then detonate the main charge, killing whoever was unlucky enough not to watch their step. Another was the S-mine or shrapnel mine. These were buried underground with several wires sticking out of the surface, waiting to be stepped on by an unsuspecting Allied soldier. Upon triggering a shrapnel mine, you'd see exactly why it got its name, or you would if you weren't in all likelihood killed. Once tripped, an S-mine would launch into the air and explode, scattering several high-velocity steel balls in every direction, which would become embedded in anyone not mortally wounded by the initial blast. Now we know what you're thinking, I'll just hide away inside a tank safely surrounded by all that armor. Well, nice try, but unless you've been enlisted in the relevant vehicle division of whichever Allied army you're a part of, then you wouldn't be able to just hop in the tank. And if you were somehow able to get in one, that still wouldn't protect you from death by landmine. Case in point, the Nazis had a whole host of anti-tank mines, the standard version being known as the Tellermine, containing an entire pound of TNT. This large, flat, circular mine, imagine the shape of a dinner plate, would commonly come with a centrally mounted detonator charge, which was screwed into the mine's base charge. When a weight of at least 350 pounds drove over it, in this case the tank you so ingeniously thought you could take cover inside, the Tellermine would detonate with enough force to tear the treads off any tank. Next up was the Holz mine, or the wooden mine. Oh yeah, you thought it was just dangerous metal objects to keep a lookout for. The goal behind the Holz mine was to avoid being noticed by the Allies' metal-detecting minesweepers. It consisted of a wooden box with 10 pounds of TNT inside that required around 250 pounds of pressure to ignite and detonate. Then there was the Riegel mine, a long, narrow rectangular-shaped device fitted with just short of 9 pounds worth of amytal explosive. These were particularly deadly because they had not one, not two, but 3 detonation methods. Multiple igniters, 1 on top and 2 on either side, were wired together and would respond to different amounts of pressure, either 440 pounds on either end or a whopping 880 directly on top. By far the most ingenious and terrifying of the Nazis' mines was the Goliath. a mine that consisted of a small vehicle like a remote-controlled car. All those Call of Duty Black Ops fans out there, think of the RCXD. A Goliath was powered by a small electric or petrol motor and controlled via a wire that its driver could use to steer it toward a target. And these remote-controlled mines could cause a fair amount of damage too, thanks to their payload of 200 pounds worth of TNT. Oh, and if you somehow managed to steer clear of all those mines while hunkering down inside that tank, there'd still be a barrage of Nazi anti-tank guns to deal with. Take the Pak-38, the standard infantry anti-tank weapon used throughout the war by the Wehrmacht, and it could punch 50mm shell-sized holes in tank armor. Later, anti-tank weapons developed by the Nazis, like the SPZ B-41, were so devastatingly powerful in their performance that after capturing one, the British were forced to speed up the development of their own anti-tank guns in order to keep up with the Nazis' engineering. Okay, so maybe being down on the ground amongst all those bullets and explosives would just mean an unfair disadvantage when it comes to your continued survival. Add to that just how difficult the battlefields made treating wounded infantry or getting them to safety. Typically, when an infantryman, like you for example, got injured in combat, a company medic would have to cautiously crawl toward their fallen comrade, at which point they'd then have to assess your injuries, see how severely you'd been hit, and figure out what to do with you, if there was anything they could do. Depending on the extent of the wound, a field medic would then have to quickly begin treatment, normally applying dressings and tourniquets to stop any bleeding, and then coating your wounds in sulfonamide, an antibiotic powder, to minimize the risk of infection. But if you found yourself bleeding out from a gunshot wound in an area that was under heavy fire from the Nazis, then a company medic would have a hard time reaching you safely without being injured or killed themselves. And of course, the longer you're lying there in excruciating pain, the more likely you'd be to develop a serious infection or catch another, more fatal bullet wound. If you were lucky enough to be treated by a combat medic, then a litter team of 4 fellow troops would be summoned from a nearby forward aid station, usually contacted over a portable radio or field telephone once the medic had managed to give you some first aid. Then the litter team would rush out and grab you and bring you back to an aid tent, sometimes protected by other soldiers. But once again, if you were under heavy fire and difficult to get to, this would make it tricky for the litter team to get to you and carry you to safety. So, given all the threats on the ground and the low probability of surviving them, maybe you want to take to the skies or sail the seas instead, perhaps thinking that you'd be able to survive 24 hours in World War II on a different front. Well, old sport, you'd be wrong. Being part of an Allied Navy or Air Force was just as deadly as life among the infantry. Kamikaze tactics, a strategy adopted by Japanese forces fighting against America, saw numerous aviators enacting ramming missions by flying their planes directly into enemy ships. This idea began at the attack on Pearl Harbor, when a Japanese airman, First Lieutenant Fusata Aida, deliberately crashed his heavily damaged plane into the United States Naval Air Station in Kaneohe. From there, kamikaze attacks started to be intentionally deployed in 1944 during the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, wherein 24 Japanese pilots launched attacks like these against a U.S. escort carrier. It resulted in one of the deadliest naval battles in history, with 34 ships being destroyed and over 5,000 crew members being killed by these kamikaze pilots. Some kamikaze planes were even provided with extra gasoline tanks and fitted with bombs in order to make them even deadlier when they crashed. In Okinawa, around 5,000 United States Navy personnel were killed in the course of a single battle thanks to kamikaze pilots. Over the entire course of the war, 47 ships were sunk as a result of kamikaze attacks, causing over 10,000 casualties. As if terror raining down from above wasn't enough to contend with, the Allied forces at sea also had the looming threat of Nazi submarines, or U-boats. They employed a tactic known as Rudeltaktik, or the Wolfpack tactic, when it came to launching attacks on convoys of ships sailing side by side with battleships escorting them. These Wolfpacks consisted of between 8 and as many as 20 U-boats who would conduct an organized attack on an enemy convoy under the leadership of a shadower, the designated submarine that would signal the others to launch the attack. Given the sheer number of U-boats used in these attacks, with submarines coming from all angles, the Wolfpack tactic was incredibly difficult for the Allied forces to defend their ships against. It also didn't help that the technological advancements of the U-boats made them practically invisible. Over the course of the Second World War, 2,700 ships were sunk by Nazi U-boats, accounting for roughly 70% of all the Allied losses at seas. Pilots flying overhead didn't have a much easier time surviving either. The Nazis weren't just packing the kind of firepower to destroy tanks, but even had weapons that could be used against vehicles on land and in the sky. The 88mm flak gun was a high-velocity cannon that wasn't just strong enough to defeat any tank armor in the world, but also accurate enough to serve as an anti-aircraft gun, with the Nazis using the same weapon in both modes without the need to make any modifications to it whatsoever. The flak was 25 feet long, fired 8 rounds per minute, and took a 6-man crew to operate. But this cumbersome cannon had an effective range of more than 10,000 meters. So whether in the air, on the ground, or at sea, you were looking at a variety of possible deaths. And if you think staying home and avoiding the war altogether was an option, guess again. In retaliation against the British and American air raids on German cities, the Nazis deployed terrifying revenge weapons against the British citizens in a bid to terrorize and undermine their morale. The Nazis' own propaganda called these weapons the V-1 Doodlebug and the V-2 rockets, Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons that they believed would turn the tide of the war in their favor. The V-1s were flying bombs, often called doodlebugs or buzz bombs, thanks to their distinctive sound during flight. These bombs were winged and powered by jet engines, launched either from a ramp or later from adapted bomber aircraft. Given that they flew on a straight level trajectory through the skies, many were shot down before reaching their targets, but certainly not all of them. A week after D-Day, multiple British civilians were killed in a V-1 attack that devastated Clapham, a part of South London, on the 13th of June 1944. A few months later, the very first V-2 rockets hit London on the 8th of September 1944. The V-2s were streamlined rockets that stood around 4 stories tall, powered by an engine that burned a mixture of alcohol and water with liquid oxygen. This carried the V-2s literally all the way up into space before they would fall back down to Earth at supersonic speed. One V-2 strike in London on the 27th of March 1945 caused 134 casualties and left hundreds of thousands of civilians homeless after their homes were destroyed. So there you have it. Just a handful of reasons that you wouldn't last a day during World War II. Oh, and private? Don't even think about trying to desert this army either, as even the Allied forces weren't above shooting their own troops who didn't want to fight. Now check out Hitler's 1,000-ton German war machine, most insane megatank ever invented, or watch this video instead.